we're going to do a little bit of a summary before we wrap up the respiratory system and look at how the nervous system regulates your breathing. By using these two images, this slide is going to show us where external respiration occurs. So remember, that's between alveolar air and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. If I click to the next one, it's going to show internal respiration. So this is blood in the systemic capillary and then tissue cells. And I'm going to use both of these images to kind of start and follow these gases. Okay, so we're going to start with oxygen, but we're not just going to start here. We're going to start way back where oxygen was produced and follow it all the way until it gets to where it needs to go. All right, and then we're going to do the same with carbon dioxide. So I want you to think about where oxygen comes from. All right, now you might be thinking to yourself, oh, it comes from the atmosphere. I want you to go back. You know, it had to have gotten there from somewhere. So how did it enter the atmosphere? Where did it come from? Now, if you're thinking, you might start thinking about a process called photosynthesis. Okay, so photosynthesis produces oxygen. All right, now where did that photosynthesis occur? Well, you're probably first thinking about plants. All right, so plants, but also algae can photosynthesize, and some bacteria can photosynthesize. They're known as cyanobacteria. So we've got a number of organisms that can produce oxygen as a waste product, right? They're producing it just like we produce carbon dioxide as kind of just a waste, and they're going to release it into the atmosphere. Okay, so then what happens to it? Well, we're going to breathe it in through pulmonary ventilation, right? So we're going to inhale and bring in that oxygen. So there it is inside an alveolus, all right? So it's part of alveolar air. Then what happens? Well, because there's a lot of it here compared to less of it in the deoxygenated blood, right? So this is the blood in the pulmonary capillary. It's going to diffuse, all right? And we call that, you know, that's half of the external respiration that occurs. So it diffuses into the blood. Then what? Well, remember, 1.5% just kind of stays dissolved in the plasma. 98%, 98.5% enters a red blood cell. Here's a red blood cell, and attaches to hemoglobin. All right. Now this hemoglobin has that hydrogen. Remember, hydrogen's kind of like a placeholder. It'll be there when oxygen isn't there. So we need to remove that hydrogen so we can attach the oxygen. Okay, and that oxygen is going to specifically attach to the iron of the hemoglobin. All right. So now what? Well, we got to transport. So where does this blood go? So if we're in pulmonary capillaries, we'll then go to pulmonary venules, pulmonary veins. We'll go to the left side of the heart, left atrium, left ventricle, aorta, systemic artery, systemic arterial, and then we're going to enter a systemic capillary. So now we're going to click to the next slide, and there we are again. Okay, there we are attached to hemoglobin. There we are dissolved in the plasma. So then how do we release that oxygen? Well, one thing that helps is acidity. So there's the acid, all right, there's the carbonic acid producing hydrogen ions. So that hydrogen ion here replaces the oxygen. It changes the shape of hemoglobin, lowers the affinity, and we release that oxygen. Okay? Then that oxygen, along with this oxygen, diffuses into the tissue cells. So this is half of what we would call the internal respiration. All right? The other half would be up here. So now what? Okay, the story doesn't end. All right? We've got oxygen inside of our cells. So where does it go next? And if you've had biology, you might have an idea. If you haven't had biology in a while, you might not have an idea. But that oxygen is going to go look for a mitochondrion, right? Mitochondria are where we utilize that oxygen. So it's going to enter the mitochondrion. What is it looking for in there? Well, it's looking for what's called the electron transport chain, which is basically the final step of cellular respiration. All right, and lucky for you, this isn't a biology class, so we don't have to get into all those details, but oxygen is required for that electron transport chain to work. It basically pulls electrons off of this protein so you can keep moving electrons. And moving the electrons is what helps generate energy, ATP. Now, what ultimately happens to this oxygen molecule? Well, it actually gets split, and half of it becomes part of one water molecule, and another half becomes part of another water molecule. So it's no longer oxygen gas anymore. All right? So what we just did was follow oxygen from where it's produced, cellular respiration, to where it's utilized. I'm sorry, did I say cellular respiration? Go back. It's being produced, photosynthesis, being utilized, cellular respiration. Okay? So now, switch gears. Let's think about carbon dioxide. Where does it come from? Well, notice it's coming from the same place this is going to. It's coming out of the mitochondria. So carbon dioxide is actually produced during what's called the Krebs cycle, or citric acid cycle. So that's also part of cellular respiration. So we generate carbon dioxide. It diffuses into the systemic capillaries. 7% dissolves in the plasma. 23% attaches to protein. It could attach to some plasma proteins, or it could actually go in and attach to the globin portion of hemoglobin. All right? But remember, 70%, most of that carbon dioxide, enters the red blood cell where you find that enzyme, carbonic anhydrase. It's going to convert the carbon dioxide and water into carbonic acid. Carbonic acid is going to dissociate and release the hydrogen ion, but there's where carbon dioxide is. Again, notice it's kind of hidden inside of bicarbonate. All right? Now, bicarbonate just so happens to leave the red blood cell. It doesn't stay in there. It moves out of the red blood cell and actually goes out into the plasma. But if we're going to move a negative ion out, it has to be replaced. So chloride will actually go into a red blood cell. This is also kind of like a placeholder. If we're going to move that bicarb out, we have to move chloride in. And that's known as the chloride shift. Okay, so now where do we go? Well, if we're in systemic capillaries, we're going to go to systemic venules, veins. Then we're going to go vena cava, right side of the heart, right atrium, right ventricle. Then we're going to go pulmonary, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries. We're going to go pulmonary arterioles. And then where do we go? We're in the pulmonary capillary. All right, so there we are. All right, so there's bicarbonate. Notice it has to come back in. So the reason why it has to come back into the red blood cell, we have to find that enzyme again. All right, so if bicarbonate comes back in, we allow chloride to go back out. So we have kind of the opposite shift. It finds that enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, gets converted back into carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide now can diffuse into the alveolar air, along with this carbon dioxide that comes off of hemoglobin, and that one that comes off that protein, and that one that comes out of the plasma. All right, so this is that other half of external respiration. So now what do we do with that? Well, we breathe it out, and it enters the atmosphere. But that's not where the story ends. So where does that carbon dioxide go? Well, same place where that oxygen came from. It's going to go to some organism that can do photosynthesis, and it gets used to make carbohydrates. All right, so that carbon will actually eventually end up being inside of a carbohydrate. Now, that's what you hope it does. If it doesn't find photosynthesis, it doesn't find an organism that can use it for that purpose, it can react with water. And remember what it does when it reacts with water. It becomes an acid. So if there's too much of this carbon dioxide in our environment, it's going to cause acidification. So it's going to acidify the oceans, right? And the oceans don't like to be acidic. They like to be above 7. They're like 8 and above. So oceans don't like to be acidic at all, but if carbon dioxide gets there, it's going to start to acidify the oceans. If it reacts with water in the atmosphere, it'll form acid rain. So basically acid rain contains carbonic acid. So we would rather be able to use all this carbon dioxide for photosynthesis, but we just don't have enough photosynthesizers, especially all the carbon dioxide that gets produced through burning of fossil fuels. All right, that's the bigger issue at hand, because we're not going to tell everyone to just stop producing carbon dioxide, because if we tell all the humans stop making carbon dioxide, we're all going to be dead. So we got to do something to reduce the production of other carbon dioxides, or figure out a way to suck some of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Okay, so that was a review. Now let's move into control of respiration. All right, so controlling your breathing has to do with your brain. All right, your brain has the control centers. Specifically, they're found in the medulla oblongata. So that's these kind of small little blue areas here are in the medulla oblongata of the brain stem. There's one towards the back here called the dorsal respiratory group. There's one in front of it called the ventral respiratory group. Those are the main ones. In fact, the dorsal respiratory group is the most important one. That's the one that when it's active, it stimulates your diaphragm and your external intercostals. The ventral group is used more during forceful breathing. And then there's actually one in the pons. If you recall, this area here of the brainstem is known as the pons. And that also kind of modifies your breathing rhythm. So we're going to pay most attention to the dorsal respiratory group. All right. Now, how does it know what to do? Well, it's got to be getting information, right? And that's from sensory neurons. So sensory neurons are going to be sending information so the medulla can figure out, okay, do I need to speed up breathing? Do I need to slow down? Do I need to tell the VRG so I can start breathing more forcefully? So we're going to kind of go from the beginning all the way through the process of controlling ultimately your respiratory muscles, because that's what controls your breathing. All right, so let's first remind ourselves how the nervous system works. All right, now the nervous system detects a stimulus using a receptor, transmits a signal to the control center using sensory neurons or sensory nerves. Control center is going to figure out what this all means. Then it's going to send out output signals in motor nerves. Those are going to control effectors that will then produce a response. And usually the response is going to be opposite the stimulus, right? Negative feedback. All right. Now, the main stimulus we're going to be talking about here is changes in pH. All right. That's a big one. All right. There's other things that we'll look at on the next slide, but the main stimulus for either increasing or decreasing breathing rate is changes in blood pH. All right. So we obviously need to know what normal pH is. 7.35 to 7.45 in your blood. That's what your blood likes to be. All right. So let's look at an example stimulus. High carbon dioxide, all right, low pH, meaning we're becoming more acidic, so we might start to develop what we call acidosis, and low oxygen. So that all is a stimulus. Now, what might cause that? Well, there's a number of things. One, you just start increasing your activity, right? If you just stand up and start walking around more, or go outside and start running, you're going to start to have to produce more energy. So to do that, you're going to use up more oxygen. You're going to produce more carbon dioxide, and the pH is going to go down. All right, so that could cause this stimulus. You could also hold your breath, That'll do the same thing. All right, a little different way, but it's also going to cause your carbon dioxide to go up because you're not getting rid of it. And it's going to use up a bunch of oxygen because you're not bringing in any more of that. All right, so that's something that will cause this stimulus. And then a third one might be kidney related. So one job of your kidneys, and we're not going to obviously get too much in depth there, is to get rid of acids. Your body is kind of always making acids. So one of your jobs, your kidney, is to prevent you from becoming too acidic by getting rid of these acids. And that's why urine is usually an acidic excretion. So if your kidneys aren't doing that, you might actually accumulate acids. All right, so that's the stimulus. All right, you have to have receptors. We use chemoreceptors. Aorta has chemoreceptors, carotids have chemoreceptors. So they detect this stimulus. They're going to have to tell the control center, so we're going to use two sensory nerves, vagus and glossopharyngeal. They tell the medulla oblongata, right, DRG, that we need to breathe more. So the medulla is going to use motor nerves, the phrenic nerve and intercostal nerves, to tell the diaphragm and external intercostals you have to increase your rate of contractions. So now instead of, say, breathing 15 to 20 times a minute, which is kind of a normal respiratory rate, we might have to increase that 20s, 30s. All right, so we increase our breathing rate. If we do that, we will get rid of more carbon dioxide. We'll bring in more oxygen, and that'll reverse the stimulus. All right, so decreases carbon dioxide, which will bring the pH back up, and that'll increase oxygen. All right, now the main stimulus is this carbon dioxide. That's the main trigger there. We're going to monitor all this, but that carbon dioxide level has the most dramatic impact on altering your breathing rate. All right. This also tells us when we get into other things like, how does the body fix acidosis, or how does it fix alkalosis? We can use our respiratory system, because if we develop acidosis, we just need to get rid of some of that carbon dioxide. What if we develop alkalosis? Well, maybe we can do the reverse. We'll breathe less. We'll keep some of that carbon dioxide in, and that can help reverse alkalosis. All right? Okay, so what else can contribute? That's actually the next slide, but this is just another picture. It's a little more visual, showing where these chemoreceptors are. So that's really the only additional thing I'm using this slide for, is that you have chemoreceptors in the carotid and aorta. You use the vagus from the aorta, the glossopharyngeal from the carotid. That's going to the medulla, and then we see the medulla. In this case, it's only showing the phrenic nerve going to your diaphragm, but you would also use intercostal nerves. And then this is, you might also have to regulate the heart, with this information. You might have to regulate blood vessels, but we're really just talking about this process to your respiratory muscles. Okay, the next thing is what else? All right, it's not just blood chemistry. There's a lot of other things that might affect your breathing. All right, and this is a pretty good slide because it separates it into, red meaning inhibitory, so it would slow your breathing, and then green is stimulatory, that would increase your breathing. All right, so we already did this one. All right, so if you have low pH, high carbon dioxide, low oxygen, that's going to increase breathing. What else? Well, you could have voluntary control. All right, you could right now decide to breathe faster. All right, you could right now decide to breathe slower or even hold your breath. So we do have some voluntary influence on our breathing. Maybe we want to, swim underwater. Well, you'll probably want to stop breathing because you don't want to aspirate water into the lungs. Maybe there's some sort of toxic gas that was released. Well, you don't want to breathe that in. All right. Or maybe you want to blow out birthday candles so you can voluntarily, forcefully exhale to blow out your birthday candles. All right, so that's voluntary. You also have a reflex that inhibits breathing. And this is known as the Herring-Brewer reflex. It's basically a stretch reflex. So if lungs stretch too much, they can get damaged. So what this does, it kind of prevents overinflation and stretching of the lungs. So if the lungs stretch a little too much, it'll actually trigger a reflex and cause you to slow your breathing. Movements have a positive effect. So if muscles are contracting more or joints are moving more, you're going to start to notify your brain, hey, we're moving. We're going to probably have to breathe more. And then pain has a positive effect on breathing. So when someone is experiencing pain, their respiratory rate will actually go up. All right, so those are all the other inputs. So this is all going to that medulla, right? That medulla and the pons. And it all gets kind of integrated to determine what our breathing rate should be. Last slide are some disorders, and these are pretty common. So I always tell students, cardiovascular and respiratory are probably the two most important systems you can learn about, because there just happens to be a lot of disorders and diseases that occur with those two systems. Asthma is a chronic airway inflammation, hypersensitivity, and obstruction. What often occurs is the muscle spasms and leads to bronchoconstriction. You get edema or swelling. You get an increase in mucus production, and the epithelium can even be damaged. There's certain triggers, but notice it's typically things in the air, except aspirin can actually trigger a more severe asthma attack. And then there's mediators, right? Your pro-inflammatories, your prostaglandins, your leukotrienes, your thromboxane, your histamines are all going to be involved in that inflammation. How do we treat asthma? Many people will take bronchodilators. So an example is albuterol. It'll relax the muscle. All right, so the bronchodilators go at the muscle spasms. Corticosteroids go at the prostaglandins and leukotrienes. And then you can also take a medication that's not a steroid, but it can block the leukotriene receptors. And then you have your COPDs, which some people put asthma in there because it has very similar characteristics and features. But COPDs are chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, and those include emphysema and chronic bronchitis. And together, those are the 6th leading cause of death. So pretty significant. Now, most of these are caused by chronic smoking. So we could probably move these off that, list if we could get people to not smoke. But there are cases of emphysema and bronchitis where it's not due to smoking. Maybe it's occupational. Maybe they work in a factory and they're breathing in really poor air. But emphysema and chronic bronchitis are typically caused because of chronic inflammation, because your immune system is constantly trying to clean up that tissue from all that nasty air, and it ends up destroying some of the tissue. All right, so those are some of the disorders. And we could go on and on about, respiratory disorders, but these are the big ones, as well as cancer. So don't forget, this number 2 killer, a lot of those are lung cancers. All right? Okay, so that ends the respiratory system. It's a good one. It's a tough one, but you're going to want to take your time through each of those topics. Let me know which ones are giving you a hard time, and I can try to help.